All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vandenberg Coalition's discussion on the lost decade, the U.S. pivot to Asia, and the rise of Chinese power. My name is Sydney Novak, and I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Vandenberg Coalition, a nonprofit network of over 120 foreign policy experts that prepares current and future national security leaders with a context, network, and vision to overcome the most significant national security challenges of our time. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has described China as the only country with both the will and increasingly the power to reshape its region and the international order to suit its authoritarian preferences. Threats posed by the CCP have led to a significant increase in U.S. national security's time, attention, and resources devoted to Asia to address the deteriorating regional balance. With us today are the authors of Lost Decade, Ambassador Robert Blackwill and Richard Fontaine, who will discuss their recent book and how the last three presidential administrations' pivot to Asia mark a dramatic departure from the entire history of American grand strategy. Ambassador Robert Blackwill is the Henry A. Kissinger Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Planning under President George W. Bush and as Presidential Envoy to Iraq and Ambassador to India. Richard Fontaine is the CEO of the Center for a New American Security. Prior to CNAS, he was a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain and worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, and on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Over the course of this conversation, Over the course of our discussion, I'd love to get into how you define the pivot, spend some time walking through the last three presidential administrations' approaches to U.S. Asia policy, and then dig deeper into the pivot's regional impact, both in the Pacific and elsewhere. And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So for those of you listening in, please have your questions ready and submit them using the chat feature. All right, let's jump right in. To level set, I'd love to know how you define the pivot and what was Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's purpose and strategy for its formulation?
Well, we, at the end of the book, prescribe a whole series of measures we think should be undertaken by the United States to finally pivot to Asia. But the crucial question is, how did the Obama-Clinton administration define the pivot, at least in public domain, when she, in the late fall of 2011, published a piece in Foreign Policy magazine. And it was explicit, at least to some degree. It said that for the first time ever, that the United States was going to not be a Europe first nation, but instead Asia would be America's first external priority, with first claim on U.S. resources and attention. So they sought during that period, excuse me.
It's the Obama administration exit.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. The Obama administration calling. They sought to alter fundamentally U.S. grand strategy since the beginning of our republic. And they said they could do that, and this was the most important way they said they could do it, by winding down the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that would then permit this shift of resources from Europe and from the Middle East to Asia. That was the core of their aspiration.
And what were policymakers and experts at the time thinking about the pivot? Did they support it? And for those who are either against it or unsure, what were their concerns?
Yeah, it was one of the things that we found interesting as we got into this, and we looked at why the pivot hadn't produced the results that had been largely anticipated and expected at the beginning. It wasn't for lack of disagreement really on the overall approach. And we should say, Bob and I think that this was the right strategic impulse to pivot to Asia. And so, you know, of all the things the Obama administration came out with, it was remarkable agreement among Republicans and Democrats and Congress experts that, generally speaking, the United States would locate its destiny increasingly in Asia. It's important demographically, economically, and for all kinds of other reasons. And of course, its chief geopolitical competitor, although people wouldn't have used that term in government at the time, China is most active in the Indo-Pacific. So there were, both because of Asia's allure and also because of China's role, there were deep and good reasons to pivot to Asia. There are a few dissenting voices. Some folks said, well, if you announce a big pivot to Asia, you're going to surround China and contain China and elicit from China precisely the kind of behavior you're seeking to avoid. That we don't make China into an enemy. It will only become an enemy if you make it into one. Other people said, well, really, our equities remain in Europe. I mean, Russia is quiet now and Europe seems quiet, but if we go pivot to Asia, what's that going to mean in Europe? And all of this. So there were a lot of questions about what this meant for different regions, what it meant less of, if anything, in Europe and the Middle East, and what it meant more of, if anything, in Asia. But there weren't really deep disagreements in the overall strategic notion.
Let me just add to that, if I might, that was the internal dynamics of the pivot within the administration. But one of the reasons that there was little controversy about it inside was that the interagency process, which produced this article and the notion that the United States was changing its grand strategy, was weak. And so they didn't pound through the way administrations at their best do, pound through all the questions which might arise if this notion was deployed in public. When it was deployed, and this was in the months afterwards, ambassadors in Washington did what ambassadors do. There was no consultation with their governments before this strategic departure was announced. So ambassadors went in and said, what's this? They went in especially from Europe and the Middle East, but also from the Indo-Pacific. And as we did our interviews, it became clear that the administration had no cogent answer to what is this, other than what was in the speech. And curiously, although they may not have meant it, and some of the folks that we interviewed said they didn't mean that this was going to be an enormous change in American grand strategy, it was interpreted very rapidly as that, and it caused anxiety in Europe that we could abandon our Article 5 commitment to defend Europe. In the Middle East, where it fortified the view that we were going home, a view that was very widespread already in 2011. And as Richard said, in the Indo-Pacific, nations worried that we were going to force a confrontation with China through this pivot, and also try to make them choose between the United States and China. So it had a very unhappy aftermath after it was publicly deployed.
So you argue in the book that President Obama prioritized the diplomatic and military pivots, but failed on the economic components. Can you elaborate how the Obama administration missed the mark on that front?
Well, TPP was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Act was not only the centerpiece of the economic pillar of the pivot. In some ways, at least some people argued it was the crown jewel of the entire effort, because here you had, for the first time ever, a pan-Asian trade agreement in which the United States would be at the center and linking like-minded countries that would enjoy market access. They'd craft the rules with, not so subtle differences between the rules that China would like to see in key areas and so forth. And, at the beginning of this, it was a small effort of, 4 countries. The United States got involved. The big prize was when Japan got involved, and suddenly this became, the long elusive U.S.-Japan FTA plus others as well, and everything else. And so over time, the Obama administration really built this out to a very ambitious thing, and officials talked about it that way in the region for sure, but also in the Obama administration. The dearly departed Ash Carter, who was Secretary of Defense, sort of famously said he'd rather have TPP approved than have a new aircraft carrier. And it was seen as having strategic importance as a signaling device of engagement and commitment to the region, in addition to the economic benefits that it would bring. But of course, it didn't pass. The administration waited until the very end of an 8-year administration to try to get it through Congress. At that point, it got caught up in 2016's presidential politics. The two final candidates on both the Democratic and Republican sides in that contest, all four came out against TPP, including Hillary Clinton, who had been a big champion when she was Secretary of State. And then, of course, once Donald Trump was elected, he pulled the United States out formally. And it wasn't just pulling out of TPP, but throughout the Trump administration, and even to this day, we pulled out of TPP. And we have nothing to offer in the way of an alternative. So now there's two pan-regional agreements. There's RCEP and CPTPP. China is a member of one and has applied to join the other. The United States is party to neither and is not offering anything as an alternative. So that's a bit of the story of kind of what happened there.
And where Obama seems to have neglected, President Trump switched gears entirely and moved full steam ahead on trade policy, declaring himself a tariff man and imposing, I think it was $250 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese-made goods. Did this greater emphasis on economic statecraft compared to military investment and diplomatic engagement continue throughout his term? And would you consider these efforts to be successful?
Well, let me perhaps take us back for a moment to the generalization that we develop in our book, and we try to substantiate that through 1,000 footnotes, which is that no pivot took place. No diplomatic pivot took place to Asia in the 2010s. No military pivot took place during that period. And as Richard just discussed, no economic pivot. And this was deeply problematical because at the same time, there was an astonishing, and that's the word we use, an astonishing rise in China's power and influence in Asia, and then at the end of that decade, globally. And the headline today is that the United States is in a much weaker position in Asia than it was when Hillary Clinton announced the pivot in the foreign policy article. We described that evolution of problematical events as one of the three most serious mistakes that the United States made in its foreign policy in the period since the Second World War, along with Lyndon Johnson's 1965 escalation in Vietnam and the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. But we think that this failure to respond to this astonishing rise in Chinese power produced a lost decade, thus the title of our book.
So I'd love to take a moment to talk about President Biden. During the Obama administration, when he was then vice president, he emphasized a new model of major country cooperation that has to be based on trust. But over time, the relationship shifted to look more like competition rather than cooperation. Do you think now President Biden's current views are consistent with this approach from a decade ago? And what policy priorities has his administration pursued that indicate that shift, even if it wasn't a true pivot?
Yeah, the Biden administration's approach to China and to Asia in general is much closer to the Trump administration's than it is to the Obama administration, even though so many of the officials, including, of course, the president himself, served in the Obama administration. I think there are reasons for that. One, during the Trump administration, by finally putting a nail in kind of the intellectual coffin of the engagement approach to China, which was premised on the notion that by engaging China in trade and all in diplomacy and information, all these other things, it would lead to the transformation of China over time, the domestic liberalization. And if not that, then China would become a responsible stakeholder in the existing international system and not kind of want to upend things. By the time the Trump administration came in and said, no, that's a failed approach. This is really a competitive relationship, and we need to outcompete China and not try to transform them. The Biden people came in and really have, I think, adopted and extended that line of thinking. So their diagnosis is quite similar to that of the Trump administration. The prescription for how to deal with it is a bit different because, President Trump was very fixated on the trade deficit and some of these other things. The Biden folks have stepped up diplomacy in some significant ways since they've taken office, elevating the Quad to a leaders level meeting, U.S.-Japan ROK and U.S.-Japan-Philippines meetings of convening the Pacific Island leaders and ASEAN, AUKUS, things like that. And they've also made some big and important advances with our allies in terms of operationalizing the U.S.-Japan alliance, posture and access in the Philippines and so forth. So one of the reasons we sort of look at this decade is because things did start to change after 2021, when President Biden came in and started a belated pivot to Asia, but it remains only a partial pivot to Asia. There's a lot of things left undone. To cite just one example, we still have no trade or economic policy in Asia, and so, but I think that the diagnosis has changed significantly from Vice President Biden to President Biden.
Absolutely. So I think another important component to this is how China views the situation. So Henry Kissinger warned this time last year that both sides have convinced themselves that the other is a strategic danger. And you guys argue that all three administrations have spoken about a strategic partnership with China and pursued an engage but hedge strategy. But they've also misread Beijing's strategic intentions. So how does China see things differently than we do? And where has the United States gotten this strategy wrong?
Well, it's important to remember that there was, as today, a rough consensus about how to deal with China when the Secretary of State unveiled the pivot in 2011. But the consensus was entirely different than the one today. That was, and this flows from one of your earlier questions, it was an engage and hedge strategy, but there was still a hope in 2011 and up all the way to the Trump administration that, as Richard said earlier, that China could be persuaded to become, in Bob Zoellick's term, a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And one of the reasons that the pivot failed was because of the belated recognition that that was not China's intent, that Xi Jinping's intent was rather to replace the United States as the most important and influential power in Asia. And although, and we give them substantial credit in the book, the Trump administration called out that reality for the first time and stopped talking about responsible stakeholder and all the rest. It turns out, if you look at the data in our book, that they too did not pivot. The military balance continued to deteriorate during the Trump administration. The economic diplomacy was erratic, to call it in the nicest possible way. And the diplomacy, there was Trumpian one-on-one diplomacy, but no systematic diplomacy toward Asia and no shift. Our forces in Europe at the end of the Trump administration were not smaller than they were in 2011, and the same was true in the Middle East. So all the way through the decade, as the rhetoric changed and got increasingly skeptical that we could persuade the Chinese to consent to our definition of world order, although the rhetoric changed, the United States continued not to do the necessary to meet this astonishing rise of Chinese power until the Biden administration, which, as Richard said, has at least to some degree ramped up until the two wars was ramping up diplomacy in Asia.
So sticking with the vein of China, and to use your words in terms of an astonishing rise in power and influence, we've also seen increased aggression vis-a-vis their one China policy for Taiwan. There have been a multitude of predictions on when China will invade Taiwan, but regardless of if that's 2027, 2030, or even the end of this year, how do you think other nations in the Indo-Pacific will respond?
Well, first, I would say that a Chinese attack on Taiwan is by no means inevitable. And some of that will have to do with what Taiwan does and what the United States does and what the allies do. So the goal is to avoid that outcome, of course, rather than have to deal with it if it eventually happens. That said, Xi Jinping has told the People's Liberation Army to be ready for a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan by 2027. That is to have the capability to do it. That doesn't mean they will, but that's the aim. The talk in the region has changed fairly dramatically in response both to Chinese actions, but also to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I think prompted people and policymakers and politicians in Asia to think, well, if the unthinkable can happen in Europe, the unthinkable could happen in Asia, and we need to be prepared for it. And you see this expressed in things like the huge increase in the Japanese defense budget that will render it the third biggest military budget in the world within a couple of years, which is kind of amazing. Australia and so forth. And so while no country has said unambiguously that it would be involved in a Taiwan contingency, of course, the United States doesn't say that either. President Biden says it, and then they say that he didn't mean it, or he meant something that was a little more ambiguous. But anyway, we have not made a very clear, unambiguous commitment. Increasingly, these countries will say it's unthinkable to them that they would not be involved in some way. So there's a sort of double negative where they say, yeah, we would be involved, but what exactly that meant, we would have to see. At the low end, it would be intelligence. At the higher end, there would be actual fighting, and so on and so on and so on. I think even more than that, if China were actually to attack Taiwan, it would be a profound shock to the entire regional security order and to leaders across the region. And I think that's sort of the nightmare scenario.
Absolutely. And you brought up Russia, so I'd love to take a moment to draw attention to China's junior partner on the global stage. As Russia continues to wage war in Ukraine, I'd love to talk about the response from the Indo-Pacific countries and what the war in Eastern Europe means for them. So we know South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore joined the US in our sanctions against Russia and provided assistance to Ukraine, with Japanese leaders even warning that Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. But there are other folks on the right here in DC that are arguing that preventing China from establishing hegemony over Asia must be the main priority, even in the face of what's going on in Europe. So what do you think about that approach, and what does a pivot to the Indo-Pacific mean not only for Ukraine, but for Europe?
Well, we don't agree with that. We think a China policy on the part of the United States ignores the fact that the United States is a global power. It has vital national interests in Europe and in the Middle East. And to abandon those vital national interests would be an enormous strategic mistake. In addition, there's inextricable connections between the security situation in Europe and in the Middle East, but especially in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. If we were now to abandon the Ukrainians, how would the Japanese national security elite view that? If we were to say, well, we were deeply devoted to saving Ukraine from the Russians, but we just got tired doing it. And so we're going to shift now our attention elsewhere. Well, I think a pretty straightforward conclusion would be drawn among our allies and friends in Asia that the United States simply doesn't have staying power. And of course, we've had that instinct in our foreign policy more than once since the end of the Second World War, a lack of staying power. So we think these regions, the three regions, are all crucially interconnected. And finally, we think that the shift in our military forces, especially air and naval, from the Middle East and from Europe can take place in the Middle East, because we can surge back as we did immediately after the war in Gaza began, and in Europe, because again, we can surge. And also, at least we have a difficult time, Richard and I, in imagining that Putin is going to challenge NATO sovereignty and Article 5 and risk a nuclear war with the United States. So we can do both. We can defend our vital national interests in the Middle East and in Europe, and at the same time pivot to Asia, thus increasing deterrence and thus making a Chinese attack on Taiwan less likely.
Just one quick point on this, because we do hear this a lot, that is, a dollar spent in Ukraine or a weapon system provided to Ukraine is one denied to our own forces or an ally or to Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore is a distraction from the big game, which is the competition and the deterrence necessary to avoid a war with, the most potentially menacing power. Well, if you don't buy our argument about the interconnection between what happens in Ukraine and what could happen in Asia, ask the Asian leaders themselves. The third biggest provider of aid to Ukraine is Japan. This is for a war that is not in Asia. It's for a war in Europe, because they are convinced that what happens in Ukraine will be important to their own security. They could say, well, we've pledged $12 billion, but really that's just kind of a waste going all the way to Europe. We should spend that stuff on resources here. Taiwan itself doesn't make the argument, but rather a different argument about the interconnection here, and has provided assistance itself to Ukraine rather than try to harbor those resources for itself. And so, the countries that have to worry about their own security come down on the other side of this.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the three regions being interconnected, being Asia, Europe, and then the Middle East. So let's talk briefly about the Middle East and what that looks like. You argue in the book that despite the rhetoric from all three administrations, no withdrawal from the Middle East actually occurred, and those resources didn't pivot to Asia. However, U.S. prestige, influence, and credibility have all steadily declined across the Middle East since the 2010s. And as a consequence, you point out that many Middle Eastern countries have turned towards China and begun hedging to reduce the risk if the United States becomes unreliable. Can you share some examples of how Middle Eastern countries have adjusted in response to actions by U.S. adversaries, be it China, Russia, or even Iran?
Well, those, first of all, you're absolutely right. We catalog in our book the adjustments that every country in the Middle East, adversary and friend and ally of the United States, have shifted their policies given their strong perception beginning at the outset of the 2010s that the United States was going home. And the pivot announcement fortified that view. But what we argue in the book is that since our actual residual forces in the Middle East have not diminished, what has bedeviled the United States in the Middle East was bad policies. We had two presidents who drew red lines, one having to do with Syria's use of chemical weapons against its population, and the other having to do with the Iranian attack on Saudi oil facilities, different administrations. And these two presidents did not back up the violation of the red lines. We had the disastrous intervention in Libya, and I could go on, and I'm sure the viewers could add examples too. So we've come to the conclusion, and this is discussed in detail in the book, that the quality of American diplomacy, especially in the Middle East, means more than the residual forces that are there. And that's one of the reasons we think we can shift our forces, air and naval, to Asia. But that will be more difficult unless the quality of our diplomacy improves over time. The United States, after all, is not genetically incompetent. It depends on who the people in office are and how they conduct, beginning with the president, our policies. But we're, I suppose we could put it like this, we're tactically pessimistic about America and world order, but we're strategically optimistic because there's no reason. In fact, there's every reason that the United States, with its friends and allies, can meet the China challenge while at the same time defending our vital national interests in the Middle East and Europe.
So I'd love to switch regions again and talk about one of those strategically optimistic bright spots, and that would be AUKUS. So you cite the formation as AUKUS and military cooperation between Australia, the UK, and the United States as an example of a true pivot in the Indo-Pacific. Can you share a little bit about the successes of AUKUS's formation and what role it plays in greater U.S. strategic cooperation with China?
Sure. Well, AUKUS originally came out of the decision by the Australians that the procurement of French submarines was no longer going to meet their security needs, that those submarines were conventionally propelled, would be insufficient to meet the threat, that they thought they would, by the time that they were actually fielded, they would be obsolete and so forth. This, of course, turned into a major both diplomatic opportunity and diplomatic kerfuffle when the Australians announced they were canceling the contract, and instead working with the United States and the UK to procure and ultimately to help build themselves nuclear propelled, conventionally armed, but nuclear propelled submarines, which is one of the biggest allied assets that the United States and its allies have in the maritime domain, like the Western Pacific. Especially given the geography of China and given the other capabilities that China has on offer out there. And so by forging AUKUS, the timeline is long. We're talking 10 years or something to get these subs in place and all of this. But, you know, it can mean up to the essentially doubling the Allied attack submarine fleet by the time this is completed. And then there was a second tier that had nothing to do with submarines. It was on advanced technology capabilities and sort of niche projects on unmanned undersea capabilities and quantum position navigation and timing and some of these other kinds of exotic things. The Japanese have now said that they would like to join AUKUS, this Pillar 2 so-called of AUKUS. New Zealand is joining this, and really it's a technology sharing platform so that allies, including countries that are allied with the United States, but not allied with each other necessarily, can share the best technology so as to build the best capability for the region and increase deterrence, which is what we all want to see.
And sticking in the veins of defense, I've heard the idiom, when we build, they build, and when we cut, whether that's military spending or otherwise, they build. And the congressionally mandated assessment of the pivot that concluded about 4 years into the rebalancing Our DoD increased its share of capabilities dedicated to Asia and deployed its most advanced new systems to the region. But we've seen China's capability continuing to grow and hold our forward deployed and forward operated forces at risk. Have we done enough, and what more can we be doing on this front?
Well, we haven't done enough since the military balance in Asia, and especially in the waters close to the Chinese mainland, has continued to deteriorate. And we have lots of graphs and data in the book that substantiates that. I might just say in an aside that the book is filled with data. Mike Bloomberg's philanthropy arm has a bumper sticker, which is "In God We Trust, Everybody Else Bring Data." And we've brought loads of data to try to substantiate that the military balance is trending in China's direction and has been for more than a decade. And while this is recognized, I think, broadly in the United States, in the elite in particular, our defense budget continues to be deeply inadequate to deal with the world in which we live. And one of our policy prescriptions is just that we need to substantially increase the defense budget, along with a variety of other measures that Richard may want to go into now.
Well, so we talk about increasing the overall size of the resource pie in defense, which is definitely necessary, and then the reallocation of some defensive capabilities from the Middle East and Europe, especially air and maritime capabilities that could go back into those theaters if necessary, but as we've seen was the case during the Gaza war and the dispatch of carrier groups there, but could be reallocated to the Indo-Pacific, again with the aim of increasing deterrence there. I mean, in the quote that you mentioned, I mean, there's talk about providing high-end systems, and of course, as time has gone on, the United States has put some of its most capable military systems in the theater. But the real question is not whether we have more sophisticated or more capable systems relative to where we were before. Hopefully the answer is yes. But where do we stand relative to what China is doing? And so there's a chart in our book, for example, that shows that 20 years ago, the United States had 150 or so more ships than China. At some point in the last 20 years, that number dwindled to zero, and now China has about 150 more ships than the United States. I mean, at some point, the quantity has a quality all of its own, and that's the thing that we have to sort of focus on if we're going to talk about the military balance. We don't have to do it on our own. We have allies and partners, and they're getting stronger and doing important things. But we do have to think about this in relative standing there.
So thinking about their growth and increasing, there's also an argument to be made that China's on the decline, with their birth rates rapidly falling, and in 2022, their deaths outnumbering new live births. Is there any kind of truth to this, in the sense like China's on the decline, and is that something that should be taken into our calculus when we're thinking about policy for the region?
Well, we have a long enumeration of the ways that China is facing difficulty both internally and externally as it clamps down ever more on its own citizens and becomes ever more aggressive internationally. But of course, the military balance is a comparison between relative capabilities by two sides. And the problem is that even though they have these difficulties, and some of them, you mentioned some, one could mention others, are substantial, even demographically profound, that hasn't slowed their military buildup. That hasn't slowed their economic penetrations of the countries in the region and beyond. Today, China is the major trade partner, the largest trade partner of nearly every country in the Indo-Pacific. Bring along with that their coercive capabilities. And then diplomatically, there's no doubt that China is much more influential, both in the Indo-Pacific, but globally than they were when Hillary Clinton launched the pivot. So I think those who say we can relax because China has these internal and external policies and they make mistakes too, which they certainly do, are wrong. China remains the only country in the world that can upend the Western view of world order and is seeking to do that. And to say, well, if we play it long, their internal consistencies will lead to their collapse, which is, I think, one of the problems with using Cold War II as a phrase. There's no sign that China is going to solve our problem for us by collapsing.
So I have one more kind of bigger picture question to pull all of these threads together before I turn it over to Q&A. So for those of you on the line, please go ahead and start dropping your questions in the chat. But I want to briefly raise America's role in the world in 2024. It's a perennial challenge for us to be everywhere at the same time. And you've touched on this, but is it possible for the United States to address the threats posed by China and focus on the Indo-Pacific and still deploy the necessary attention and resources in other areas where we have national interest?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And ultimately, that's what our book is an argument for, is to say precisely that. It would be wrong to say China and Asia are just like every other region, and they're kind of all the same. We should distribute ourselves across the whole world evenly. It would also be wrong to say that China is the only thing that matters, and we don't care what happens in Europe and the Middle East. We don't have interest there. Both of those are wrong. So what is the right answer? Well, the right answer is to redistribute and reallocate your time, attention, and resources to Asia, but to do so in a way that will meet the China challenge, but do so in a way that preserves our interests and commitments in places like the Middle East and Europe. I mean, if Russia invades a European country, it is going to naturally be of interest to the United States. If ISIS were to build the kind of terrorist caliphate in the Middle East that it once did not so long ago, that will be of interest to the United States. We have interest bound up in these places. And we also have these things called allies and partners, and that is one of our great strengths. It often takes American leadership, but it can also include allied activities and resources and capabilities. So it is entirely possible to do precisely what you said. And I hope that our presidential candidates at some point can articulate a case for how they see us able to do that.
Hopefully. So we've got a couple questions coming in. First one, the last Cold War was defined primarily by a sort of ideological struggle between the Democratic West and the Communist East. Certain people, such as Matt Pottinger and Rep. Mike Gallagher, have suggested that we're entering a new Cold War era, defined by competition between an open society and a closed society. Is this ideological framework the best way to think about international relations today, or do you prefer something else? I know you kind of mentioned being against this Cold War 2.0 mentality, but how would you frame it?
Well, it's not binary choice in our view. First of all, of course, we have to continue to seek a tolerable global balance in every dimension of our national power. But I think one of the problems with the Cold War II analogy, in addition to the one I mentioned, is that the differences between that applied history, to use the academic term, and the current situation are so great that I think that the use of Cold War II is not illuminating. In fact, it's confusing, and because when you use such a term, of course, you jump right to prescriptions. And for example, we never called, including President Reagan, for regime change in the Soviet Union. It happened because of the various internal internal developments within the USSR. There are some in our country who now say that regime change and victory over China should be our mantra. But the problem with that notion is that none of the allies we have, none of the partners we have will join us in that objective of regime change in China. Not one. And the United States does better in the world when we have our right-minded allies and partners with us, not when we are isolated and going it alone.
So next question from the audience. Is there an alternative to the TPP that would grow the economic pie for defense of the region and get political traction in the United States?
We think so. If it were up to us, which it's not because we're not elected officials, we would get into CPTPP, the TPP successor, and sort of get on with the trade and economic leadership show. But let's say that that's a bridge too far, either because we don't have a president who wants to do it or because you don't think it can pass the Congress. So is the alternative then to do nothing at all? We don't think so. There are digital trade agreements that would be not about so much about market access, the way you run into political issues on autos or steel or agriculture and things like that, but more about the rules under which that trade is going to be conducted and whether those rules favor the United States' view of these things and its allies, or the autocratic, surveillance-minded sort of views that that China would like to see obtained. So bilateral digital agreements, a regional digital agreement, sectoral agreements in particular areas, again, those that are less politically sensitive than the ones that we all know sort of get opposition moving at home and so forth, could not only be helpful in demonstrating that we're actually involved in this process and providing some economic engagement, but also as stepping stones to show that the politics eventually may actually allow for re-entry into a big trade agreement like TPP.
So there are some who think that Russia, especially due to its isolation from their invasion of Ukraine, is the junior partner to China, and that therefore we should pull Russia away from China in an attempt to contain the CCP's behavior. Do you think this is a serious position? What do you make of it? And what, if anything, can be done about that relationship?
Well, coincidentally, Richard and I, our next project is going to look at the Russia-China relationship, and we're well into the research on that. And we have a Council on Foreign Relations study group that has been looking at that. And our research, and I think those who know these two countries well, indicates that the likely future of that relationship is closer and more intimate in their collaboration to try to weaken the United States globally and the Western order globally. And I think we don't believe that there's any space for us to draw Russia away from China, at least in the foreseeable future.
My colleague, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and I have written about the what we call the axis of upheaval, which is Russia, China, and of course, North Korea and Iran all working more closely together in very concrete ways. And so one of the things sometimes you hear bandied about is exactly what Bob was talking about, what you were asking about, which is, well, why not just drive wedges between these countries rather than have them be closer to each other than they are to the United States and can, perform this big, dangerous sort of quasi block? Let's peel one or two of them away and make them understand they get a better deal from us than they would get from each other. Well, if you imagine that, then you got to imagine what would that deal look like? We could, I guess, go to Russia and say, actually, we changed our minds on Ukraine. You can have it all as long as, or as much of it as you'd like, as long as you, don't ally with China. We could or so forth. But each of these four countries wants a sphere of influence, right? Russia wants it in the near abroad. China wants it in Taiwan and the South China Sea and its core interests. North Korea wants it on the Korean Peninsula. Iran wants it in the greater Middle East. And unless we're prepared to acquiesce in their construction of those spheres of influence and do nothing to stop it from coming about, which I think would be highly unwise, then the idea that we would be able to offer these countries a better deal than they would get from each other just doesn't fly.
Another question from the group. Do you think pulling out of Afghanistan helped or hindered our strategic competition with China?
It damaged it because the way it was done, because nations make general judgments about the competence of their friends, their allies, and their adversaries. And the incompetent way that that our withdrawal was done, of course, called into question whether we usually have two left feet in our diplomacy. And so it was unfortunate. It weakened confidence in us, not only in the Middle East and Asia, but everywhere, as they watched the spectacle of the utter chaos in a situation in which, of course, we tried to do it too fast. And the experts not only said that, or many experts not only said that afterwards, they said it before. But the administration, the president, ignored the advice he was given, and we saw what happened.
So I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative for the last question. In our last few minutes, I was hoping that without giving too much away, you would mind walking through the principles you outlined for a renewed pivot and a new grand strategy directed at the Indo-Pacific, and also how the U.S. could benefit from these adjustments.
Well, I guess, yes, like giving too much away in the sense that you say what happens after the murder weapon is found or something. So I guess we should leave something.
People read the book.
we should leave something to the reader, I suppose. But it's probably not a huge secret, like a whodunit. But some of the core elements of what we propose is, as we were talking before on the economic side, re-entry into TPP or the CPTPP, or if that's a bridge too far politically, then to pursue some of these sectoral agreements like digital trade agreements, either bilaterally or multilaterally, a significant increase in the defense budget so that there's more resources for everyone, given the fairly unprecedented number of crises and the demand for national security and defense resources around the world with the wars and everything else. The reallocation of some military resources, especially in the air and maritime domains from Europe and the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, a doubling down in articulation of why our values are frankly superior to what China has on offer, that we're not just in some competition with the United States and China. We stand in favor of a region in the Indo-Pacific that is fundamentally permissive for freedom and democracy and sovereignty and independence of countries and things like that. So you put these things together and do all of that again while you're maintaining your commitments and protecting your interests in other regions. And then I don't know how much we actually articulate this, but it's worth reflecting given the conversation we've had. Sustain the policy. I mean, this has been the hardest thing, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but in the Middle East and everything else. And I think so much of this is what leads to the idea in other countries' minds that we either don't know what we want, or we change our minds, or they can't fully rely on us because we say we're not going to Syria, then we're going to Syria, then we're going to get troops out of Syria, but we don't get troops out of Syria, then we say we're getting troops out again, but then we leave them there and now they're here, and this other stuff. Or pick whatever issue you want. Sustain the policy over time and try to build a bipartisan consensus around it.
I would just add one more, which we haven't mentioned, but is self-evident, and we do mention it in the book. This pivot to Asia that we recommend in the strongest possible terms in our book is dependent on a coherent consensus and cooperation in our country between the two political parties. And if we tear ourselves apart in domestic disorganization and worse, then it would be extremely difficult for us to effectively pivot to Asia. So back to your question about the balance, a great deal depends with respect to our balance with China, is how we or if we come together to conduct a bipartisan policy toward this generational change that China represents for the United States.
So I do have one final question, and it's probably the most important question I've asked over the last hour. Where can the people listening in buy your book?
Well, there's a place people might be vaguely familiar with called Amazon.com. So that's probably where a lot of people will go. Apparently Prime will deliver that thing really quickly. There's a bunch of other book websites, Oxford University Press, I think you can buy directly from there. And maybe at some point soon find bookstores everywhere. But certainly Amazon and other book websites make it available, and happy reading.
Well,
and if you find it too heavy to carry around, there's a digital version on Amazon.
Exactly.
Rich, Ambassador Blackwill, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to those on the line for listening in. I thoroughly enjoyed the book as well as this conversation. And I think it gives us a lot to think about when it comes to not only the next presidential administration and what that means for US-Asia policy, but our strategic priorities in the foreign policy community. So thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.